The night I stumbled onto the truth started like any other. I was sitting at home, tired from a long shift, unwinding in front of the TV. Rachel, my wife of 5 years, had just returned from a study group at her university. She'd enrolled in a psychology program last year, something she'd always dreamed of. I was proud of her, supported her ambition, and never questioned her commitments. But that night changed everything. Rachel walked in, her face pale, her expression distant, like she was lost somewhere far from our living room. "You okay?" I asked, trying to keep it light, but something in her eyes sent a chill down my spine. She nodded, but it was unconvincing. "Just tired," she whispered, heading straight for the bathroom. I let it go for the moment, telling myself it was just exam stress. But when she came back, her eyes were red-rimmed. My heart sank. She looked terrified, like she was about to say something that might change both our lives forever. "Will, I need to tell you something." Her voice cracked as she spoke, and I felt a sudden jolt of adrenaline. I forced a nod, swallowing down the lump in my throat. "What is it, Rachel?" I managed to ask, my mind racing through the possible scenarios, none of which prepared me for what came next. She lowered her head, wringing her hands. I've been seeing someone else." The room spun as her words hit me. It felt like a punch to the gut, and all I could do was stare at her, struggling to breathe, to process what she just said. You've been cheating on me?" My voice was barely a whisper. Her face crumpled as she nodded, and then, before I could react further, she added, It wasn't something I wanted. Will, he's my professor. He's been..." She paused, struggling for the right words. "He's been forcing me." Those words brought a new kind of confusion, anger, and dread. I didn't know what to say, how to feel. I trusted her completely, supported her dreams, and now I was hearing that her professor, a man she respected, looked up to, had taken advantage of that trust. I could feel my blood boiling. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, the frustration and pain mixing into one sharp question. "I tried to handle it alone," she choked out, her voice breaking. "I was afraid. He's a senior faculty member. He has connections. I thought if I came forward, he'd ruin everything." I took a deep breath, trying to steady the surge of anger and protectiveness that was rising. "You're not alone in this. We're going to make him pay for what he did." For the first time, I saw a spark of hope in her eyes. We were going to take this on together, and I was going to make sure he'd regret ever crossing that line with her. The professor wouldn't know what hit him. The following morning, I woke up early, barely rested, my mind still replaying Rachel's confession. The professor's name was Dr. Eric Palmer, one of the most respected psychology lecturers at her university. I'd never met the man personally, but I'd heard enough about him from Rachel. He was the charismatic, well-liked type, the kind of professor that students admired, and apparently, trusted enough to get close to. That was his advantage. He knew how to hide in plain sight. Rachel and I sat at the kitchen table, both of us barely touching our coffee. I kept glancing over at her, seeing the lingering fear on her face. She looked worn down, defeated, and it killed me to see her that way. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. "We need a plan," I said quietly, breaking the tense silence. "Something that doesn't just expose him, but makes him lose everything." She looked at me, her brows knitting together. "How though?" "He's careful, Will. He never texts anything incriminating, and there's no proof that he did this." I nodded, thinking it through. "Then we'll need to trap him. Make him show his true colors." Rachel swallowed hard, but she gave a determined nod. I could see the pain, the humiliation, but also a glimmer of something fierce and unyielding. She wasn't going to back down. "We'll need to get inside his head," I said. "Find out where he slips up. What does he think he can get away with?" Rachel bit her lip, staring down at her mug. He likes to flaunt his power, I guess. He's had other students over at his place under the pretense of extra sessions, and he acts like it's all part of the mentoring process. No one suspects him, Will, because he's so careful. Then we'll make him slip, I said, my mind racing. If he thinks he can operate without consequences, we just have to push him, give him enough rope to hang himself. I could see Rachel beginning to understand, and she nodded slowly. We were going to set a trap he couldn't resist. That night, I spent hours poring over every detail Rachel could remember, every interaction she'd had with Dr. Palmer. We would figure out how to expose him, publicly, irrevocably. Rachel would stay as calm as she could around him, feeding him just enough to make him think he still had control. And I would be there to capture every incriminating detail. As we went over the plan, I realized that this man, this predator, would never see it coming. He thought he had all the power, but we'd make sure he'd lose it all. In the days that followed, Rachel returned to her classes, her eyes now steeled with a sense of purpose. Meanwhile, I'd begun planning the details of our revenge, preparing for every possible outcome. I told her to act like everything was normal, to be friendly and cooperative, and to let him think she was still under his control. It was a dangerous game, and one that required nerves of steel. Late one night, Rachel mentioned that Dr. Palmer had invited her to another of his office hours sessions, the private kind he reserved only for certain students. This was the opening we'd been waiting for. Text him, I told her, keeping my voice steady, and ask if you should come dressed appropriately. Rachel hesitated, her fingers hovering over her phone. Are you sure? What if he catches on? He won't, I said confidently. If he really believes he's untouchable, he won't see this coming. Just play along, Rachel. I could see the doubt in her eyes, but she gave a small nod, typing out the message and hitting send. Almost immediately, her phone vibrated with his response. She handed it to me, her face unreadable as I read his reply. Absolutely, darling. And don't be late. I felt a surge of disgust and anger as I read his message. The arrogance was undeniable. He was so sure of himself, so confident that he could manipulate and intimidate her into silence. He'd have no idea what was coming. We spent the next few days carefully setting up hidden cameras and microphones in Rachel's bag, making sure they wouldn't be detected. We'd been testing the equipment, making sure it was clear enough to capture every incriminating detail. As the night of the session approached, I could feel the tension building. Finally, the night arrived. Rachel was dressed in casual clothes, nothing that would seem suspicious. Before she left, I took her hands in mine. This is it, I whispered, trying to keep my own nerves in check. Stay calm, let him say what he wants to say, and remember, you're in control. She gave a shaky nod, squeezed my hands, and left for his office. I sat there in silence, watching the live feed on my laptop, my heart pounding as she entered the campus building and headed down the quiet hallway. Dr. Palmer opened the door, and I caught a glimpse of him, a tall, smug-looking man with an easy grin. He greeted her warmly, ushering her inside as he closed the door behind her. I could barely contain my rage as I watched the scene unfold. Rachel, he said, his voice smooth, I'm glad you could make it. You know I only make time for special students. Rachel nodded, playing along, though I could see the tension in her posture. Of course, Dr. Palmer, she replied. I'm grateful for all the opportunities you've given me. He chuckled, completely oblivious. It's my pleasure. After all, we're both here to learn, aren't we? For the next few minutes, I watched in silent fury as he circled around her, touching her shoulder, standing close enough to make her visibly uncomfortable. He made suggestive comments, each one more incriminating than the last. It was exactly the evidence we needed. And then he made a critical mistake. Rachel, he said, leaning in close, how would you feel about taking this to my place next time? I think we could both benefit from some privacy. I could see Rachel tense up, but she managed to keep her voice steady. Your place? She asked, playing innocent. He smiled, clearly pleased. Yes. We'll have more freedom to express ourselves. You'd like that, wouldn't you? I clenched my fists as I listened, my mind racing. This was the perfect opportunity to take him down, to expose his lies in front of everyone. We would follow him, catch him in the act, and reveal the truth. But there was still one more part to this plan, and it was a twist even he wouldn't expect. The following day, Rachel walked into Dr. Palmer's classroom with a new sense of confidence. He was under the impression that he still held all the power, but now Rachel was the one in control. She had agreed to meet him later that week at his home, and we'd carefully planned every move to make sure we'd catch him in the act. I watched the feed from the hidden cameras and reviewed the audio files over and over, ensuring every incriminating word was crystal clear. Then, Rachel and I decided to take the plan one step further. She would encourage him to invite a few more students over under the guise of private study sessions. The idea was risky, but if we could get him to reveal his predatory behavior in front of others, we'd have more than enough to ensure his reputation was ruined. Rachel approached it subtly, letting him think it was his idea to have more discreet gatherings. She played along perfectly, feigning nervous excitement at the thought. Dr. Palmer was too smug, too blind to realize he was being set up. He loved the power he held over his students, relishing the idea of his little gatherings, and he agreed eagerly, even suggesting a weekend when they could all get together. On the day of the session, I parked a few houses down from Dr. Palmer's home, ready to follow up with the final part of our plan. I'd convinced one of Rachel's friends from campus, a girl named Lily, who'd also confided in Rachel about Palmer's inappropriate advances, to join. Lily was furious when she found out about our plan and agreed to come along as a witness, determined to help bring him down. The evening arrived, and Rachel, along with Lily and 2 other students who'd fallen prey to Palmer's manipulative ways, arrived at his house. I watched from my car, carefully positioned to catch everything with my camera's zoom. Rachel had placed her hidden microphone in her bag, the audio streaming directly to my laptop. Inside, Palmer welcomed them all with that same smug smile, offering drinks and trying to play the charming host. I could see Rachel tense, keeping her distance but smiling politely, waiting for him to make his move. Lily was recording discreetly, pretending to take photos, capturing every detail. Then, Palmer made his next move, a move that would be his undoing. He began complimenting the students, talking in a tone that was unmistakably suggestive, as he casually draped an arm around one of them. I could see the disgust on their faces, but they played along, nodding politely as he spoke. The night went on, and Palmer, emboldened by his audience, grew bolder. He hinted at private mentorship, mentioning how he could help them advance in their studies if they were willing to be accommodating. I watched, my anger simmering, as he leaned toward Rachel, whispering in her ear, fully confident that he was safe within the walls of his home. But little did he know, every word was being captured. And then, just as we had planned, Rachel gave the signal. As Palmer leaned in, Rachel subtly pressed a button on her phone, sending me the signal to make my move. I took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline rush as I got out of the car and walked up to the house. I knew that what we were about to do would either destroy him completely or backfire if he suspected anything, but this was the moment of no return. I rang the doorbell, and after a few seconds, Palmer opened it, a slight look of surprise crossing his face as he saw me standing there. He tried to hide his reaction, quickly replacing it with that fake, welcoming smile. "Will," he said, his tone forced. "I didn't realize Rachel had invited you." He sounded almost amused, as if he could play this off as a casual meeting of friends. "I thought I'd stop by," I replied smoothly, glancing over his shoulder. "I heard you had a little gathering planned." Palmer's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. But before he could respond, Rachel appeared behind him, giving me a reassuring look. "Dr. Palmer was just telling us about his unique mentoring methods," she said with a faint edge in her voice. Palmer's smile faltered, and I saw a flash of worry cross his face. "Just some academic advice, of course," he muttered, stepping aside to let me in. The other students exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable, but waiting to see how this would play out. As I entered, I made a show of looking around the room, noticing the way Palmer seemed to watch my every move. I could tell he was trying to gauge how much I knew, but I kept my expression calm, almost disinterested. I wanted him to feel the tension, to realize he was losing control. "So," I began, turning to face him, "you've been quite busy with these private sessions, haven't you?" Palmer stiffened, a flash of irritation crossing his face as he tried to maintain his composure. "It's all part of the job," he replied, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his tone. "My students appreciate the extra attention. Is that right?" I replied, giving him a long, hard look. "Because it seems like there's a bit more to these sessions than just academic guidance." The room went silent, and I could feel the tension building as Palmer realized that he was backed into a corner. Rachel and the other students stood quietly, their faces a mixture of anger and disgust, waiting to see how he'd try to weasel his way out. Palmer took a deep breath, forcing a calm expression. "I think you're misunderstanding, Will. This is all perfectly professional." "Oh, I'm sure you think so," I replied, crossing my arms. "I'm sure you think no one would question a professor who has students over for mentoring sessions late into the night." He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Lily stepped forward, her voice shaking with anger. "Dr. Palmer, you know exactly what you're doing. You've been using your position to intimidate us, to make us think we had to comply if we wanted to pass." Palmer turned pale, his confidence slipping as he realized he was being exposed from all sides. He tried to laugh it off, but it came out forced. "This is absurd. You're all blowing things out of proportion." I reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone and pressing play on the audio we'd recorded from his earlier conversations. His voice filled the room, echoing his lecherous words back at him. The students stared, horrified, as the truth of his manipulations was laid bare. Palmer's face went white as a sheet. He stumbled back, visibly shaken, realizing there was no way out of this. "Wait, I didn't. You've all misunderstood." "No, Dr. Palmer," I said, cutting him off. "This is exactly what you think it is. And you're going to answer for every single one of your actions." Rachel gave him a cold, steady gaze, her voice calm but filled with a quiet fury. "We trusted you. We looked up to you. And you used that to get what you wanted, didn't you?" Palmer looked around the room, searching for any hint of sympathy or understanding, but he found none. Every face around him was filled with betrayal and contempt. He was finished, and he knew it. After a tense silence, Palmer finally managed to speak, though his voice was shaky. "This is all a misunderstanding," he insisted, his eyes darting around desperately. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. The demands of my job, the expectations. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." But his words were hollow, and everyone in the room knew it. He was scrambling, trying to save himself with excuses that sounded more pathetic with each passing second. Rachel crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "We're done listening to your lies, Dr. Palmer." He looked like he wanted to respond, to defend himself, but he seemed to realize it was pointless. Instead, he turned to me, his face twisting into a sneer. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" he spat, his voice dripping with bitterness. "You think you can just walk in here, ruin my career, my life, for what?" "For the lives you've already ruined," I replied coldly. "You use your power to manipulate, to control, and to harm. It's time you face the consequences." Palmer opened his mouth to protest, but I cut him off. "This recording? This is going straight to the university administration. And we'll be sharing it with everyone, every professor, every student. We're going to make sure that everyone knows exactly who you are." His face drained of color, as he realized just how far we were willing to go. He took a step back, muttering to himself, and for a moment, I thought he might try to fight us. But he seemed to understand that there was no escape. Not this time. Rachel stepped forward, her voice steady and resolute. "We've all spent months, years even, being afraid of you. But that ends today." Palmer looked at her, his expression twisted with anger and desperation. "You think you're heroes? You think you're going to win? You don't understand. I have connections, people who will back me up. You're all just students, no one's going to believe you." I couldn't help but let out a laugh, shaking my head at the absurdity of his delusions. We have enough evidence to make sure they do. And when we're done, you'll never work in education again. Palmer stared at us, his face a mix of hatred and fear, but he seemed to understand that he had been defeated. He turned away, his shoulders slumping as he muttered curses under his breath, completely deflated. The mighty professor, the man who had lorded his power over his students, was now reduced to a pathetic, broken shell. Rachel glanced at me, a flicker of relief in her eyes, but I could see the weight of everything that had happened in her gaze. This was only the beginning of his downfall, but it was a start. The next morning, Rachel and I entered the university administration building. The place was quiet, almost empty, and we were led to a conference room where Dean Franklin, a serious-looking man with graying hair, was waiting for us. His face was unreadable as he gestured for us to sit, but I sensed his discomfort. Rachel and I exchanged a look as she slid a stack of evidence across the table: recorded audio, printed messages, statements from other students, and the incriminating photo Lily had taken of Dr. Palmer leaning too close to Rachel. This wasn't a friendly meeting, this was the start of Palmer's downfall. Dean Franklin cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he looked over the evidence. Dr. Palmer is one of our most respected faculty members, he began cautiously, and he's contributed greatly to the psychology department. Are you certain about these accusations? Rachel didn't hesitate. Absolutely. He's been using his status to intimidate students into inappropriate situations. This isn't just about one misstep, this is a pattern. The dean's face paled as he scanned the documents, his expression shifting from skepticism to horror as he flipped through the statements. When Rachel played an audio clip, Palmer's voice laced with slimy innuendo, Dean Franklin's eyes widened in shock. Rachel, Palmer's voice purred through the recording, I think you'd do well to remember who you're speaking to. Compliance can go a long way in this program, you know. Dean Franklin flinched, his face slack with disbelief. I didn't know, he muttered. How long has this been happening? Rachel's voice was steady but tinged with bitterness. Long enough that I could find others who experienced the same behavior. It's been happening for years. Dean Franklin set down the evidence with trembling hands, looking at us with a mix of shock and sadness. This is damning, and the university can't ignore it. Dr. Palmer will be suspended immediately, pending a full investigation. If these allegations hold up, he paused, choosing his words carefully. He will be terminated, and any criminal actions will be reported to the authorities. We nodded, and Dean Franklin's eyes filled with a cautious hope. I appreciate your bravery in coming forward. We'll cooperate fully with the investigation. Leaving his office, Rachel and I felt some weight lift. We'd taken the first step, but I knew the administration might still sweep things under the rug if given the chance. To ensure Palmer faced justice, we needed the story to reach everyone on campus. I pulled out my phone, opened a secure messaging app, and sent the recordings and statements to a trusted reporter from the campus paper. Within hours, the news broke. The story spread like wildfire, students and faculty sharing it online, shocked by the scandal. Palmer's face was plastered on every social media platform, his reputation tainted by his own vile words. The next day, the campus was a frenzy. Students gathered in small groups, reading the article on their phones, and as Rachel and I walked through the quad, we passed by clusters of students demanding answers. Someone had hung posters that read, "Protect the students, not the professors," and "No more silence!" The dean stepped out of the administration building, trying to calm the crowd. His speech was measured and full of promises about increased accountability and meaningful change. But the students wanted action, not assurances. A few brave souls in the crowd called out for transparency, demanding to know how a man like Palmer had been allowed to abuse his position for so long. Rachel squeezed my hand as we watched the students, a faint smile on her face. "They're finally seeing him for who he really is," she whispered, a spark of relief in her voice. Over the next few days, we watched as the university scrambled to contain the fallout. Students organized rallies, professors publicly voiced their support, and the administration was forced to make a statement about Dr. Palmer's suspension. Emails flooded the campus news site from other students who had suffered in silence, each message revealing the same ugly story. The pressure mounted until the administration had no choice but to act. Finally, they announced that Palmer's contract was officially terminated and that he would be permanently banned from campus. They also promised to overhaul their policies to prevent future abuse. It was a victory, but a quiet one. The damage had been done, and Palmer's career lay in ruins. He'd lost everything: his job, his influence, and any hope of regaining his position. Watching the students take their power back had been a sight to see, and for the first time, Rachel looked at peace, knowing she wasn't alone. Palmer was finally held accountable, and we knew that whatever happened next, he'd never be able to manipulate anyone again. The system had failed her, but Rachel's courage, combined with the voices of so many others, had forced real change. As we left campus for the last time, we felt a quiet sense of closure. Palmer's downfall was complete, his reputation destroyed, and the students were safe from his influence. When the news of Dr. Palmer's termination hit campus, the reaction was explosive. Students were furious, not just at him, but at the university for allowing someone like him to operate unchecked for so long. Groups formed online, organizing protests and demanding a full investigation of the psychology department's practices. Within days, the movement spread beyond campus, drawing attention from local news outlets. The story of the predatory professor became a rallying cry for reform. Rachel and I watched in awe as the ripple effect took hold. This wasn't just about Palmer anymore. Students were calling for transparency, for stronger policies to protect students from abusive authority figures. It was powerful to see them rise up, uniting against the system that had allowed him to thrive. Rachel's phone buzzed constantly with messages, some from classmates, others from strangers who had read the articles and wanted to share their support. Many of the messages came from former students who had been victims of Palmer's tactics but had never felt they could speak out. Their stories were heartbreaking, a painful reminder of how far his influence had reached. For Rachel, it was validation that coming forward had been the right choice. In the days that followed, I could feel the tension across campus. As we walked past groups of students, their voices filled with anger and determination, I realized that Palmer's exposure was only the beginning. The university was in damage control mode, scrambling to manage the fallout. Dean Franklin, usually invisible around campus, had become a regular presence, addressing crowds of students and answering their questions with carefully rehearsed statements. But it wasn't enough. Finally, an announcement came: the administration would be holding an open forum in the auditorium, inviting students to share their concerns and discuss reforms. Rachel was nervous about going but determined to see it through. "I want to look them in the eye," she told me. "I want them to hear from the people they failed." The night of the forum, the auditorium was packed. Students filled every seat, standing along the walls and even spilling out into the hallway. At the front of the room sat Dean Franklin, alongside several high-ranking administrators who looked visibly uncomfortable under the weight of so many hostile stares. Dean Franklin opened with a measured speech about the university's commitment to student safety, promising that they were working tirelessly to make the campus a place of trust and accountability. But the students weren't satisfied. Hands shot up, voices calling out questions before the dean even finished speaking. The administrators exchanged nervous glances, clearly unprepared for the level of outrage they faced. Rachel raised her hand, and when she was called on, she stood, her voice strong despite the tension. "Why did it take so long for Dr. Palmer to be held accountable?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the dean. "Why were students ignored when they came forward? This isn't just about one professor, it's about a system that protects abusers." Dean Franklin stammered, caught off guard by the directness of her question. He tried to offer an explanation, talking about policy reviews and due process, but the students were having none of it. They called out questions one after another, each more pointed than the last, demanding answers for the university's lack of action. One student stood up and recounted her own experience with Palmer, her voice breaking as she described the fear and humiliation he had caused. Another shared a story of reporting him to a faculty advisor, only to be brushed off and told she was misunderstanding his intentions. The room fell silent as more and more students came forward, each story fueling the anger in the room. The administrators looked overwhelmed, visibly shaken by the sheer scale of the problem they had failed to address. Rachel's hand shot up again, and this time, her voice was laced with fury. This wasn't just negligence. This was complicity. You knew. And you chose to protect him because he was valuable to the university. How many more students would have suffered if we hadn't forced your hand? Her words hung in the air, a challenge they couldn't ignore. The dean's face fell, his eyes a mixture of shame and fear. You're right, he admitted finally, his voice barely audible. We failed you. And for that, I am deeply sorry. But the students didn't want apologies, they wanted action. Someone called for a vote of no confidence in the administration, a symbolic move, but one that held a clear message. They wanted change, and they wanted it now. The room erupted in agreement, the students chanting, "Accountability! Accountability!" as the administrators sat, pale and silent, under the weight of their demands. The meeting ended with promises of policy reforms, regular reviews, and a new student-led oversight committee, but the crowd dispersed slowly, still buzzing with a mixture of anger and triumph. Rachel and I lingered outside, watching as students gathered in small groups, talking about what had just happened. For the first time, I saw a lightness in Rachel's expression. She had faced her fears, spoken out in front of everyone, and in doing so, had forced the university to confront its own failures. She turned to me, her eyes bright. "It's over, Will," she said quietly. "We actually did it." I nodded, wrapping my arm around her shoulders. "We did. And now, it's their turn to fix it." The university followed through with some of its promises, setting up the oversight committee and implementing stricter policies regarding student protection. For weeks, the administration was on edge, eager to prove that they were serious about change, but the students remained wary, determined to hold them accountable. As for Palmer, his fall from grace was complete. Word spread quickly that he had retreated to a small town far from campus, unable to show his face in the academic world ever again. A few rumors circulated, whispers about lawsuits and potential criminal charges, but whatever his fate, he was finished. His reputation was irreparably tarnished, his career ruined. In the end, he was left with nothing but the consequences of his own actions. Rachel and I tried to return to normal life, though the experience had changed us both. The ordeal had been painful, draining, but it had also given us a new sense of strength. Rachel continued her studies, her confidence restored, no longer haunted by the shadow of her former professor. One afternoon, months after the forum, Rachel received an email from the university's Student Services office. They were inviting her to share her experience in a series of workshops designed to educate students and staff about recognizing and reporting abuse of power. It was a symbolic gesture, but a powerful one, and as I watched Rachel read the email, I could see a quiet sense of pride in her eyes. "They actually listened," she whispered, looking up at me with a small, hopeful smile. "They are finally doing something about it." I took her hand, feeling a deep sense of pride in her bravery. "You made this happen, Rachel. You gave them a voice." She nodded, her gaze steady. "I just hope they keep listening. No one else should have to go through what we did." With Palmer gone and the university finally taking steps toward real accountability, Rachel and I could finally put the past behind us. We walked away from campus that day with a sense of closure, knowing that while we couldn't change what had happened, we had ensured it would never happen again, not to her, not to anyone. In the months following Dr. Palmer's exposure, life on campus transformed. The university, pressured by continuous student advocacy and media attention, moved quickly to restore trust by overhauling its policies on faculty-student interactions. New training sessions were implemented, and a mandatory ethics review was put in place. But for many students, the biggest change was intangible, a renewed belief that their voices mattered, that they had the power to create real change. Rachel and I tried to settle back into our routines, but remnants of the ordeal lingered. Occasionally, we'd spot an article online about the scandal at the university, or overhear people discussing Palmer's disgrace. Some students even approached Rachel, thanking her for her courage. Each interaction was a reminder of the pain she'd endured, but also of the difference she had made. She accepted the thanks with quiet grace, understanding the impact her actions had on those who felt similarly trapped. One afternoon, months after the forum, an email arrived in Rachel's inbox that changed everything. It was from a news outlet, a national one. The journalist wanted to follow up on the story, and they had uncovered something shocking. Palmer had been recorded in another compromising situation, and this time, it wasn't just audio. They found video, Rachel said, her voice a mixture of surprise and disbelief. She turned the laptop so I could read the email myself. The journalist explained that, through a separate investigation, they'd uncovered footage of Palmer meeting with students in highly inappropriate situations, recorded secretly at an off-campus location. According to the journalist, someone at the university had leaked it to the press, unable to stomach the thought of Palmer going unpunished. Rachel's face strained of color. Will, this is huge. They're going to release it to the public. The video footage meant there would be no doubt, no question of who Palmer truly was. Up until this point, the university had been able to keep some control over the narrative. But a video that would shatter any pretense of misunderstanding and erase any sympathy for Palmer. It was undeniable, irrefutable proof of his misconduct. The news broke the following morning. The footage showed Palmer with multiple students, engaged in what was described as intimate interactions, clearly violating every ethical and legal boundary between faculty and students. The video, blurred to protect the students' identities, was broadcast nationwide. Social media exploded with reactions: horror, disgust, anger, and most of all, a burning desire for justice. On campus, the reaction was swift and brutal. The students were no longer just demanding changes to university policies. They wanted every staff member who had ever enabled Palmer's behavior to be held accountable. Several professors were identified as having turned a blind eye or dismissed student complaints. The administration was now fully under the spotlight, struggling to defend itself from a student body that had lost all patience. Rachel and I watched it unfold from a distance, feeling both relief and a strange sadness. Palmer's downfall was complete. He was barred from ever holding a teaching position again, his reputation in ruins, his legacy a cautionary tale of power abused and trust betrayed. But there was one more twist to come. Several weeks after the video release, we received a call from Lily, one of Rachel's friends who had also come forward against Palmer. She sounded shaken, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel, I have to tell you something. I don't know how to say it, but you need to hear this. Rachel put her on speakerphone, exchanging a worried glance with me. Lily, what's going on? Do you remember when we first met Palmer? Lily's voice was thick with emotion. He always acted so charming, like he was above everyone else. Well, I found out he kept a hidden camera in his office. That's how they got the footage. Someone tipped off the press, and they found it there. We were stunned into silence. It was one thing for Palmer to act inappropriately, but to record himself with students? It was beyond reckless. And it made sense now why he'd always seemed so confident. He thought he had all the control, even over his victims' privacy. But his arrogance had finally become his undoing. The call ended, and Rachel sat in silence, processing everything. Palmer had left a trail of victims, but his self-assurance, his delusion that he could control everything and everyone, had finally caught up with him. The students he thought he could manipulate were now watching his life crumble from a distance, with the whole world bearing witness. As the months wore on, life began to feel normal again. Rachel continued her studies, the university's policies continued to evolve, and Palmer was now just a dark chapter in the university's history. Rachel and I spoke of him less and less, until he was only a faint memory, a reminder of a time when we had both been naive about the power others could hold. One evening, as we walked through campus together, Rachel paused, looking around at the students who laughed and studied and lived freely, uninhibited by fear. "You know," she said softly, "I used to walk through here, and I'd feel so small. I thought people like Palmer had all the control. But now I know that we have the power to stand up to them." I squeezed her hand, feeling a profound sense of pride. "You were brave, Rachel. You made this happen. Palmer thought he was untouchable, but you showed everyone that no one is above accountability." She nodded, a smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "We all did. I wasn't alone." As we left campus that night, we felt a deep sense of closure. Palmer's story was over, and the university, scarred but wiser, had taken steps to rebuild. And Rachel, stronger, braver, and no longer burdened by fear, was ready to move forward, leaving behind the past and the man who had tried to control her. Months passed, and the scandal surrounding Dr. Palmer finally began to fade from public memory. The university had enacted sweeping policy changes, retraining staff and implementing new protocols to safeguard students against similar abuses of power. Rachel had been asked to speak on panels about student rights and university reform. She became an advocate for those who felt silenced, a role that suited her natural empathy and newfound strength. Life was beginning to feel peaceful again. But one evening, a letter arrived. Addressed to Rachel, it was postmarked from a correctional facility several states away. She looked at it with a mix of curiosity and dread, her fingers trembling as she opened it. I stayed close, my heart pounding as she unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the letter, her expression hardening with each line. "It's from Palmer," she whispered, her voice tense. "He says he wants to apologize." "Apologize?" I repeated, incredulous. The idea that Palmer, of all people, could feel remorse struck me as unbelievable. "Rachel, he's just trying to mess with your head. You don't owe him anything." But Rachel kept reading, her jaw clenched. The letter went on in disturbing detail, his words veiled in pseudo-regret, almost as if he were lamenting his lost power rather than showing genuine remorse for the pain he'd caused. He spoke about the stress of academia, the temptations he couldn't resist, and even hinted that he felt betrayed by his own devotion to the university and its students. Then, his words took a turn. "He's blaming me," Rachel muttered, her voice a mix of anger and disbelief. "He's saying that if I hadn't misunderstood his intentions, he'd still have his career. That I played the victim." I felt a surge of anger as I listened to her read, the self-pity and twisted logic in Palmer's words stoking the fire that I thought had burned out long ago. Rachel was silent, her fingers clutching the paper tightly, her face unreadable. "Will," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "He thinks he can still control me, even from a prison cell." The reality hit me then. Palmer hadn't learned anything. Even stripped of his career, his reputation, and his freedom, he clung to the delusion that he held power over her. But he was wrong. Rachel's expression shifted, her resolve hardening. She reached for a pen and a fresh sheet of paper. "I'm going to respond." "Are you sure?" I asked, concerned. "You don't owe him anything, Rachel. You don't need to give him the satisfaction." She looked up at me, her eyes blazing. "He needs to know he has no control over me. Not anymore. I'm writing this for me, not for him." I nodded, understanding. This was her final stand, her last word in a battle that had nearly broken her. I watched as she wrote, her words deliberate and strong. She told Palmer exactly what he'd done to her, to the students, to everyone who had once trusted him. She told him how he had ruined lives, how his actions had left lasting scars, and how his pathetic apology only served to reveal the emptiness inside him. She ended her letter simply. "You are nothing. You have no power over me. You never did." Rachel folded the letter and handed it to me, her eyes unwavering. "Will you mail this for me?" "Of course," I said, my own voice steady with pride. I took the letter, feeling the weight of her final words to the man who had tried to control her life. As we walked to the mailbox together, Rachel took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as if releasing the last remnants of Palmer's hold on her. "It's over, isn't it?" I nodded, a smile breaking through as I wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Yes, Rachel. It's over." We dropped the letter in the mailbox, watching as it disappeared, a symbol of her triumph over the past. As we walked home, I felt a profound sense of closure settle over us. Rachel had found her voice, her strength, and in doing so, had taken back her life. She was free. And with that final act, so was I. The story of Dr. Palmer faded from the headlines, but Rachel's strength remained a lasting reminder that power only exists if you allow it. She had proven that no matter how dark things may seem, there is always a way to reclaim your light. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, hit like and leave a comment with your favorite part. We'd love to hear your perspective.